Welcome to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. Today we're going to be talking about Virginia's List, a political action committee that supports progressive women running for office here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Joining me is the chair of the board of directors of Virginia's List, Julie Jakopic. Thank you so much for being here, Julie.
Thanks, Catherine, for having me.
So this has kind of been a journey putting together this PAC in Virginia, because while there have been other organizations over the years that support women, explain to us why having a PAC is unique.
So there's a couple of things to think about. Virginia's List is a PAC for progressive Democratic women, and I think all those words have a piece to them. Here in the Commonwealth, we mirror the country. 19% of our legislators are women. 19%.
And that's low for the country.
It's low for the country. The average in the country is about 25. But quite frankly, it's low because we're half the population.
We're 50% at least of the population.
And here, undoubtedly, slightly more, at least in the country, we're slightly more. So the lack of representation is an issue. And having been a woman candidate, as you have, there's some definite things that are different.
That is true.
You know, many of us who are in the business of service have been trained not to ask for stuff. Well, guess what? Running for office requires you to ask for something in every single conversation. You need someone's vote or their money. Women give less, so we need more women to contribute to our campaigns, and women candidates get less from the same donors. So the fundraising piece is more, and for folks who don't understand what the fundraising is about, if a candidate could actually talk to every potential voter, they could probably win them over. But the truth is they can't reach them all. And so what the money goes to is the mail and the TV and the Facebook ads that introduce you to the people you're not going to get a chance to talk to. And so if you can't raise the money and you can't get in front of the voters, you can't win an election. So we need a PAC to help women who are running get into position so that they can compete well, that they can show voters who they are, they can introduce themselves and maintain that communication with the voter that they wouldn't otherwise have.
So Emily's List is sort of the national model, and a lot of people have heard of Emily's List because they endorse candidates in all 50 states, and they raise a lot of money. But what a lot of people don't understand is that Emily is not a person's name. It actually is an acronym.
It is. It stands for Early Money is Like Yeast. And it's a very practical thing. If you're setting out on a campaign and you need to figure out how many times you're going to reach a voter, you got to figure out the math. And then you've got to know that you can raise the money. And the money you get early enables you to create a better plan to reach more people more often between the time you start and the day of the election, which, you know, Virginia is an interesting place. We have elections every year, and in odd years we elect our House of Delegates in our statewide races, which we'll be doing in November.
And we also have municipal elections. There really are elections here every year, and sometimes when you've got elections in May in cities and in towns, you've got two elections. So in Virginia it is unique, and people get voter fatigue here as well. But part of the viability test when you go to endorse a candidate, and we'll talk about the process for how you decide how to endorse, who to endorse, is the fact that part of the viability test is how much money someone's raised. So it's kind of a catch-22. In order for people to think you're a viable candidate and to give you money, you have to have raised money. So explain a little bit about that cycle.
It is a cycle, and there's no getting away from the sort of catch-22 paradox of it. But I don't think the test is, have you raised more money than anyone else who's ever run for that office? But have you raised a credible amount to get started? So it's not a particular number, and it may not even be that you're already outraising your candidate. But if you can't ask for money and you can't get people to give you money, you can't ask for their votes and you can't win. So it's a marker for your capacity to get people to support you, your capacity to inspire them to get up at 6 o'clock on some Tuesday morning to stand in line and take time out of their day to choose you. And the raising of money is part of how you do it. And I think what we're trying to do with Virginia's List is to look to candidates who we think can win and give them an edge that they wouldn't otherwise have so that they can reach more voters. And that means starting early.
So I guess at this juncture, I'm going to mention VPAP, the Virginia Public Access Project, but vpap.org is the place where you can go and see who is running, in which district, and how much money the candidates have raised based on their quarterly filings. So this is something the public, anyone in the public,
Absolutely.
has 100% transparent. It's the access to what people have raised, and also donors, which is another way that a lot of people figure out who to call to ask for money, is they go to the donors by zip code and they look for the people who've donated before. So, you know, there are other organizations like Emerge Virginia comes to mind, who are trying to identify and to train women candidates, but they do not raise money or give money to individual candidates. We are not in the business of recruiting or training. What we are doing is offering money, especially early money, to get some of these women jump-started for the basic necessities, whether it's a bumper sticker or it's their first mailer or whatever it is, to get them going, to make them look like they are a credible candidate. So what are some of the other sort of collaborative efforts we have?
Well, and I think it's kind of interesting because Julie Copeland, who is my colleague at Emerge Virginia, and we think it's funny that we're both Julie and we confuse each other in our own emails, but are working together on an event to raise money. One of her board members wants to help raise money for us. So, you know, there's a training component and there's a financing component. And we really try to provide the financing to help folks who hopefully already have either had some training officially through an organization like Emerge, or have worked on campaigns so they know what they're actually up against and what how to do what needs to be done. And so it's actually been a great partnership. There are other kinds of organizations in the state that, the Commonwealth, that also gather money to identify candidates on particular issues. There are organizations that focus on the environment. There are organizations who focus specifically on choice. There's all kinds of organizations out there. What I think makes Virginia's list different is it uses the Emily's List model. We make decisions amongst candidates. We get behind folks early. And at the end of the day, it actually matters that we're supporting women.
Right, and so people need to be good consumers of where their money goes, right? So there are a number of ways in which you can be involved in an election cycle. You can give directly to the candidate, but some people have not necessarily done the homework to find out just how viable the candidate is. Although, like I said, through vpap.org, there is some research you can do to figure out where that candidate stands, and also how the district has voted in the past, because the past voting behavior of a particular district is a pretty good indicator of how they're going to vote in the current election cycle. So all of those things are important, but I don't know that people necessarily do that work. They tend to give to organizations they trust. However, a lot of those organizations are not, in fact, focused on women only. They give to men and women candidates who support their issue. So what is the benefit of people saying, if you want more than 17 to 19% women in our legislature, you need to be giving your money to the people who are doing the homework, doing the outreach, you know, basically vetting these candidates. Talk a little bit about how you are vetting these candidates.
Okay, so I think there's two questions in there. Let me start with what's our process look like, and then I think there's a question of why women. Our process, we've really worked hard. We're a 2.5-year-old, I believe, organization. This is really our first full election cycle, so we worked really hard on coming up with standards that we were going to use and metrics that we were going to use to endorse folks. A number of people on our board have run in primaries and understand how important the primary is. If you can't get the candidate out of the primary, she can't win.
Right.
So we've made 11 endorsements of, actually 11 House of Delegates candidates. And we looked at their capacity, what did they understand that they needed to do, how many votes do they need to get, and how are they going to get them. We looked at where they are on their plan, how many doors have they already knocked, how many people have they already talked to, and how much money have they raised. And then we also did look at something that's called democratic performance, and it's two metrics, really. It's a score that looks at what the likelihood a voter is going to vote Democratic is and how many of them are likely to turn out. So it's an intersection of turnout numbers and numbers of those people who are Democrats. In part because if we're trying to elect Democratic women, and we, you know, in a perfect world, we'd have enough money to fund everybody who met any of our standards. We don't. We're a 2.5-year-old organization. My experience running was that most folks will endorse but not give money during a primary, and we made a very strong commitment as a board that we were going to invest in the primary first, and again in the general. And so we looked at all three of those things to be very clear about who we were supporting. And given that we were doing that a little bit in the dark, it was kind of fun to watch and look at who Emily's list endorsed and the alignment between the two lists. Because they used, we were using a similar kind of metric, and that was a little bit helpful. So the folks that we've endorsed, and you can see them on our website, virginiaslist.com, are also almost all, not 100%, but almost all also endorsed by Emily's list at the national level, who also cares about getting women elected at the state level, because that's where our statewide and national candidates come from.
Absolutely, building a bench of talent. And so some of the endorsements are for incumbents, and some of the endorsements are for new candidates. Some are running in an open seat, some are running, and there are 2 women candidates, which, we have an abundance this year in 2017 of women who have stepped up and decided to run. So what does it look like when you've got 2 women candidates in a district, and what is the process for how you process that request for an endorsement?
Challenging. In a word, challenging. I think we've got some women candidates who are running against each other, both of whom we would actually love to support, because on all the other metrics, they are really, really strong. We have some cases where there's a big difference in the viability, to use the political word, the likelihood of winning, both at the primary and the general level, where there's a substantial gap. For the most part, we stayed out of races that had 2. We actually stayed out of races predominantly that had 2 viable women candidates, because we may end up endorsing one or the other of them after the primary. But it is challenging. I think that's part of what was the challenge of coming together to figure out where to make those endorsements. But for the most part, it has come down to what's the likelihood of winning that district, and where is this candidate in their process of winning it. It is unbelievable training to run for office, and it is incredibly hard work, and it requires a 24-hour commitment every day between the day you announce and the day of that election.
Which, as you pointed out, you have run and I have run. Yeah. And until you've done that, it sounds great to run for office, but there's a lot involved in getting up and what you do every day until you go to bed, in addition to whatever real job you have. So when we come back from this break, we're going to talk a little bit more with Julie Jakopic about Virginia's list and women candidates running for office here in Virginia.
Calls me googly eyes.
You know you're beautiful, right? You know that?
Even you are beautiful. I got bullied for wearing glasses. Share if you're against bullying.
We put it out there, just took off. 3 million people have shared this post. Don't let bullies get you down. I stand with you. Our whole family's wearing glasses. I wear glasses and I'm proud.
I even have the army on my team.
All the kind comments brought my child joy. I don't feel thank you is enough.
Thanks. They're coming. Places, everybody.
Light check. 1, 2, 1, 2.
Everything looks good on our end.
And lights.
Come alive with the forest. Visit discovertheforest.org to find a forest near you.
Welcome back to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and today we're talking with Julie Jakopic, who is the chair of the board of directors for Virginia's List. This is a PAC which raises money to support women candidates running here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, Julie.
Thanks for inviting me.
So let's talk a little bit about how people can not just support our PAC, but an overall strategy for supporting women who are running, particularly those of us like myself who are in a district where my delegate does not have a challenger. I live in Fairfax City. David's pretty cool. He doesn't need my help. So how does this afford an opportunity for people to get involved in other ways?
Well, what David does need is colleagues.
Yes, David needs colleagues.
So in Virginia, we have 100 districts. 34 of them are held by Democrats. If we want to increase our role and our capacity to get the kind of legislation that we care about through the House, we need more members of the House. So if David doesn't have an opponent and is going to win, investing in David, while he may want money to give to the caucus, and he's going to ask for money because he also wants to remind voters who he is, and it's perfectly fine to give to David. But if you want to help David have better colleagues, you give to a PAC who will be vetting people in another part of the state. I also live in a district where my delegate is unopposed, the neighboring delegate is unopposed. I'm happy to help them, but Virginia's list is where I'm giving my money because we have in our state, we had 109 Democrats filed to run at the end of March. 58 of them were women.
I know, that's incredible.
I'm
That's
sorry,
a record.
109 Democrats, 58 of them were women.
Right, and that's a record.
And that is an incredible record that we want to build on, and it's an incredible opportunity. The other thing that's interesting is we hold 34 seats, but there's 17 districts in the Commonwealth that are represented by a Republican but voted for Hillary Clinton.
Right.
And a number of the women that we are hoping to help, that we're helping and that we're hoping win, are running in those 17 districts because it's an incredible opportunity to increase our numbers in the state. And if, for example, we were actually able to turn over every one of those 17 seats, we'd have 51 delegates. Which would be a
majority of one.
So, I'll take a majority of one over a 2-to-1.
That
2
is
to
true.
1, right?
That is true.
So it's very important to do that. The other thing about electing women is about perspective. And I think we talk about this in terms of diversity everywhere. I've had a number of folks who say, yeah, but you got to pick the best person. Prominent women donors say to me, you got to pick the best person. Prominent women donors who have also faced their own less than equal experiences in their careers say to me, but you got to pick the best. So let's talk about that one for a second.
Yes.
If we're looking at a guy who has an A and a woman who has an A-, her A- is worth every bit of his A because she had to fight for every one of those opportunities.
The challenges are different.
The challenges are different, and I think one of the things that's been hard to explain, for example, to millennials is the challenge isn't at the beginning of the career. It's that mid-career place where women get stuck. And so if you're 25 years old and you're at your first job, the guys who are working next year are probably making the same thing. Wait till one of you gets promoted.
Yeah.
Wait till you go for that next promotion. And that's where it starts to play out. So in a leadership role, when we're choosing leaders, a woman who is almost the same is actually probably ahead of the guy for that perspective, even if you don't buy that argument. Perspective at the table really matters. I've spent a good chunk of my career working on policy for low-income families. But I actually think that the most important policy thing I ever did was in the car on the way to work one morning with my late husband, who was looking at welfare reform and waivers for states to experiment with things they could do. And this particular state was going to offer the drug that could be surgically implanted. At the time, at that point, it was something called Norplant, which we don't use anymore. But it was a birth control method that could be implanted under the skin and last for a long period of time. And at the time, it cost about $500 to get. And he said, well, what do you think? What do you think about that? And the question I asked was, is there money in their budget to take it out? And he said, huh? And I said, well, first of all, you're implanting medicine, otherwise known to some as poison, into someone's body that they can't afford to have removed if they have a bad reaction. And secondly, it might just be that somebody moves on in their life and is doing better and wants another child. So is there money in your budget to take it out? And he looked at me as if I had 3 heads and went back to the 4 men who were making the decision with him and said, guess what my wife said this morning?
Right.
If I had not had that conversation, no one would have gone back to that state and said, wait a minute, you're going to help pay to take it out, which of course they did, rejigger their waiver and got to do. But if I hadn't been in that conversation, and it's not, if a woman hadn't been in that conversation, no one would have asked that question because it's not part of their the guy's experience.
I think we saw that with the 12-month of birth control, the legislation that passed. It's kind of like there are a lot of people who never think about, well, what is the problem with doing it 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, and having to call and having to get another prescription and the expense involved of having to go back because it is prescription and get that every 3 months. And there's no real cause. There's no underlying reason for that, but it takes women advocating for the fact that the expense and inconvenience is ours.
It's expense and convenience, and it's time. So many of the women who are affected by that are actually low-income single moms who don't have sick leave. They don't have
Right,
3 extra days a year of sick leave to get the prescription filled.
Yeah, and and the other one is the Dignity Act that got killed in committee that Jennifer Boysko sponsored about removing the sales tax on feminine hygiene products. If you think about what women pay in sales tax from the time they are 12 years old until they're 55 on products that are not optional, this is not a luxury good. They're expensive, and every month you buy them, and every month we're taxed. 50% of the population is taxed. And men do not see this as an issue, not an issue for them.
No, it's not. And they don't think about it. And I don't actually think that the guys are trying to be bad or trying to punish us. It's not part of their experience.
It's not on their radar.
It's just not on their radar. Exactly.
And I think having a different perspective, a different lived experience does make a difference. I think you see this with, we lag behind paid leave in this country, not just all 50 states, but at a federal level, because the people who've been making policy are not the ones who do daycare. They have been predominantly men.
Well, and the other reason to elect women is if the issues you care about are day-to-day things like leave, medical care, child care, education in general, there are individual men who will carry those bills, but the likelihood of bills being carried around those issues, not always in the direction that Virginia's list and would always want, but if you want legislation around those issues, elect women because we're the ones who carry it. The guys will vote the right way, but they're not going to fight for it.
And that comes down to advocacy. It really is, you're absolutely right. People advocate for the things that either they're passionate about or their constituents have come to them and asked them to carry. And a good example of that, I'll never forget the breastfeeding bill, which was passed here in the Commonwealth, and that was Kate Noon and Rebecca Geller who came together to organize women around the state, but it was Dave Albo who carried the bill. And why? Because they wanted it to pass. And that means the people doing the work giving it to the identified man in the House of Delegates who could garner the votes to pass it. And that, I think a lot of people don't understand how the game of politics is played in our legislature.
Except it's just not that complicated. Every kid has gone to mom or dad for allowance and made their case for money for their date this weekend or money for the play thing they want to do or money, right? We've all done it. And we've all been in a situation where we went to one parent who said no and we snuck off to the other one.
Right.
Or we played them off each other to get what we want. Small p politics is really the art of persuasion and getting support for things. And it's in that hashing it out and fussing over those arguments that I think is where good policy gets made. It's not always perfect at the start. It's those dialogues that I think create.
And I think you're right too about policy has to be people-centered. People, that's why we have policy, is to make lives better for the people in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And yet we have left out 50% of the people, both who benefit or who are burdened by policy, by not having a place at the table. And so I sort of feel that, with Virginia's list, the case needs to be made for why people need to give money to a PAC that has identified this as a goal. It's a very narrow goal, progressive Democratic women, and creating a place for them at the table.
The reason you give to a PAC is deep interest in what we're about, and hopefully, I don't know, maybe as many as 50% of your audience or better would be interested in what we're about. And it's also because your delegate's going to be fine, right? But without colleagues, they can't get anything done. And most of us struggle enough to just get through understanding the issues in our home community. We're not likely to go figure out who the 3 candidates in Virginia Beach are and who's running in the Northern Neck and what's happening in Richmond. And I think it's our job as PACs to both help inform that process, but it's our job to study that answer and direct funds to people that we know will meet our tests, to progressive Democratic women running in places they can win, but not places that are a slam dunk so much as really trying to change things.
So as far as, determining, as you said, sort of people who meet the progressive test, whatever there is, there's something called a candidate questionnaire, a CQ, as PACs call it. And candidate questionnaires are sent out to candidates, and if candidates don't receive one, they can easily go to the virginiaslist.com website and request a candidate questionnaire. But these are where the board of Virginia's List has sat down and decided what sorts of benchmarks or tests or criteria we have that says that you support what we've identified as being the core values of Virginia's List or progressive women in Virginia. So that process continues how long?
The way we've done it this year is we set some deadlines for when we were going to make decisions. And we've asked everyone who filled out a questionnaire for the primary to submit again after the primary for the general. And we will set a date by which we're going to sit down and go through all of them. We'll make sure all of the candidates know, and I suspect by the time this airs, they will know what that date is, and we'll try to do it early. My sense, we've talked a little bit, I think this is going to air in July. There's an election in November, folks, if you haven't already caught that.
That's right.
There's an election in November
7th,
that really
November
matters
7th.
on November 7th. And so as early as possible, we want to make endorsements in the general election. Again, the early money is like yeast model of get candidates money early so that they can, in fact, prevail in the general.
And not all endorsements come with money either. So there are candidates that will be endorsed as having 100% on their candidate questionnaire, and they're in a winnable district, but we still have finite resources that we have to work with.
We do, and I think the other thing, and we haven't talked about this, but if we were to endorse and give money to everybody across the board, it dilutes the impact of the help we're giving.
Right. And that's something I want our viewers to keep in mind. When you decide how you want to expend your resources, whether it's directly to a candidate, to a PAC like Virginia's List, keep in mind that you want your donation to have the greatest impact. So visit virginiaslist.com to figure out how you can support women running for office here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Thank you so much, Julie, for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Catherine.